briefly, Dr. Eric Williamson, I am on faculty at the Perelman School of Medicine at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania, but I also am the director of the VA Center, MS Center of Excellence at the Philadelphia Veterans Administration. I think those of you that might be in the VA system would know how to, if you wanted to try to see me in that system, to go about it. In case you don't know how to figure out how to become a patient at HUP or at Penn, there's a few cards here, but really I'm not here to kind of promote that. I'm here to try to help you understand. I have about 30-some slides, but I also want to save time, ample time to let you ask questions. Please, if you have something that comes up that I say or that you want to ask more about, make a little note, or if there's something that this stimulates, we'll leave some time for that at the end, okay? So I do understand we have a curfew, though, so I want to jump right in and kind of get started here. I'm just going to start with what do we know, or what do we think we know about stem cells or stem cell therapy and multiple sclerosis? So there's certainly been a lot of advances in stem cell medicine. This gives us perhaps hope that maybe stem cells could repair or regenerate. I'm going to talk about that a little bit. But there's also a number of questions out there when it comes to the science. I'm going to kind of review a few of the overarching ones. We have limited controlled trials. I don't know, you're all probably coming from different places or spaces. I even know that some of you may have taken part in some of the controlled trials done at some of the research institutions in this country or even elsewhere. But so far, we kind of have a lack of proven safety and benefit, and that's why there actually isn't any approved stem cell therapy, not an FDA-approved treatment for MS, certainly, and really not for any diseases. Treatment, despite these limited trials, is being offered, though, okay? There are a number of private sites, private clinics, where you could pursue and get a stem cell treatment. So I want to talk a little bit about that as well, what is out there. So I mentioned that this is something that's exciting. It certainly grabs headlines, right? So here's a couple headlines from a journal that people like me pay a lot of attention to. So the American Academy of Neurology puts out something called Neurology Today. If you saw this headline, myelinating oligodendrocytes, first you start to say, what is an oligodendrocyte? Some of us would ask that, so I'm going to talk a little bit about that. When they say derived, so that they've actually, and I'll give you the details later, taken cells and then kind of turned them into cells that may promote growth, okay? And another headline here is a little bit confusing, right? Because I said there's sites out there that are doing this. Well, there's also some concern about what we call unregulated sites or some of the private clinics. Next, I kind of want to do two other different headlines that really highlight where the science is. So on the research side, we have hematopoietic stem cell trials and mesenchymal stem cell trials primarily, okay? And I'm going to come back and give you the definition of those. But I think this is a headline that probably a lot of people in this room maybe saw recently or this past summer about a stem cell trial in Canada showing that the effects or the ability to stop disease has lasted up to 13 years out. Just to give you the headlines, and we'll go into this again, there were 24 patients that were in this trial over a decade. A number of them were having attacks despite being on other therapies. And then once they were treated, and the treatment here is important to understand, it involved a chemotherapy regimen, so kind of like a priming treatment before they got what are called hematopoietic stem cells. Importantly, there was one death, okay, and that had something to do with the chemotherapy regimen. You'll see what I mean by these pre-treatments in a moment. So in the end, it's unclear what role the stem cells may have had. We haven't shown evidence in a trial like this, and the investigators would be the first to tell you that they're really repairing or regrowing anything. And then even if they're changing the immune system or stopping the disease is in question, because the pre-treatment could also have been the reason why that happened. So this is the hematopoietic side versus the mesenchymal stem cell side. So I'm actually going back in time a little bit here, back to 2011, because this is when it first hit the newsstands. The Cleveland Plain Dealer advertising what was going on at university hospitals, talks about a patient, a story that could be very familiar to all of you. He's diagnosed, he takes medications, they may not be stopping his disease. He entered the trial where they took stem cells. In this trial, they actually took them from the bone marrow, grew them in a lab, gave them back to him, and he says that after this, I could move my left arm, or I could move my left leg in a way that I couldn't before. Talks about maybe fatigue was a little bit better. The vision's a little bit less impressive maybe. I went from 20/25 to 20/20. Also, in this article, which was just months after the trial started, they commented that his MRI hadn't shown any new disease activity. One thing that I'll say up front about these mesenchymal stem cell trials versus the hematopoietic is that now, 5 years later, the data that has been presented has shown that these patients will have MRI activity. Some of them, they may have relapses. So it doesn't look to be perhaps as efficacious or as strong a treatment. A lot of us would say, well, maybe that has something to do with pre-treatment regimen or stopping the inflammation. So many of these trials don't involve chemotherapy up front. So it's unclear, but they did have less disease than prior. So we say, well, maybe these cells themselves are immunomodulating or changing the immune disease in some way. And then, this patient talking to the paper says that, hey, I've gotten better. What we haven't seen, though, is then the investigators or the people doing the trial make that same sort of a claim. Whether you'll find that in print from this or others, you may find it at certain places, but I would question, what is the source? Is this really coming from the investigator of the trial or not? And I'll show you some more headlines later, but I wanted to start up front with a few here and then kind of cycle back to those other couple at the end. So if you think about a stem cell therapy and evaluating how it might work, what's exciting is the idea of regeneration, okay, repair. And what's also important to think about is changing the immune system. So if you have a disease that's causing damage, you may need to stop the damage just as you need to fix or repair. Sometimes it's a little bit more of one versus the other, but these things can be going on simultaneously, or we would hope that maybe these things could both be going on when you think about a stem cell therapy or the benefit therein. I'm going to review some of the data that we do have from trials to date. I think that it's important to start up front with some definitions. And my goal at the end of all this is that you can better look at a headline like this or look at what they're saying and understand what we mean by hematopoietic or by mesenchymal stem cells. And then I want to give you the tools to decide what might be right for you, if this is the kind of a therapy or the kind of a trial, perhaps, that you might want to be involved in. So first, what's a stem cell? Well, a stem cell is simply defined as a cell that's self-renewing, okay? It can replicate on its own. There are a lot of different kinds of stem cells. Some of them are very specific, so cells that can make more nervous system cells would be different than cells that can make liver cells or cells that can make blood cells. Two important topics or points, I guess terms is a better word, up front is there are cells that can become anything. So right after conception, think about an embryo. These we would call pluripotent, so they can go down a lot of different pathways. As things go along, some cells, like those in the bone marrow, are more specialized to become blood cells, whether that's immune cells later or blood cells that carry oxygen. So we have multipotent cells, which would be have less ability to become anything than a pluripotent cell. And then we have, on the opposite end of the spectrum, very specific cells. Even inside of neural stem cells, you can talk about oligodendrocyte progenitor cells, which are ones that can make oligodendrocytes versus other nervous system tissue. So where do we get stem cells? We're talking about trials, and you guys probably heard a lot of these terms talked about or offered as treatments, perhaps even. Adult stem cells, that means taken from fully developed people like us. You can get them from different tissues or organs. Fetal cells, pretty self-explanatory where they come from. Some people think that they may have different properties or slightly different properties than adult cells and the ability to replicate. Cord blood cells, a hot topic. So cord blood cells, theoretically, these are going to become blood cells down the line. But we're getting closer and closer to embryonic stem cells. There's actually also a lot of regulation here, okay? There's a lot of political interest. There's a lot of, I don't want to, I guess I'd say religious or other ideas about where we should be getting cells from, but certainly in this country, embryonic stem cells are kind of off limits, all right? At the bottom, I started to talk about induced pluripotent cells or induced multipotent cells. So this is the idea of taking a cell and then kind of reverse engineering. So you could take a cell from someone's fat, you could take a cell from someone's skin, and then try to step backwards or perhaps tinker with the growth media to turn it down a different pathway. Other important terms for you to understand are whether you get cells from yourself, so they're homologous or autologous, versus from someone else, or an allogeneic transplant. So a lot of words, a lot of terms. Ask me again later if you didn't get it. I'm going to try to do it a couple of times, okay? Again, in MS, I've said this once, but I think it's worth repeating. The ultimate goal is that you've got to stop damage. If there's still damage going on, there was damage at some point at least. So reducing inflammation, trying to prevent demyelination or prevent degeneration of axons. You also, we would hope, if there was damage, would like to repair it, right? So promoting regeneration, not just replacing cells, but maybe augmenting the body's ability to repair itself, which it can do. That's the whole idea of a relapse and remission, right? So the body is actually able to do this to some extent. So primarily, or firstly, I guess would be another way to say it, you try to protect the nervous system from this problem that's happened. And then second, we'd hope to repair. I will bring up an important point here, an important topic, and this is a central nervous system disease, but it has a lot of downstream effects, right? So the hope, if we're giving stem cells to promote axon regrowth or remyelination, is that will lead to downstream effects. It's kind of an idea I put here of trickle-down effect, right? So giving stem cells to one person with MS might not be the same as giving to the next person, at least in terms of what disability they may have. But if we're going to talk about stem cells as a treatment, we're talking usually top-down and hoping that it will have all that effect, okay, versus there are other diseases, right? So people that lose a limb or have problems with certain organs, you may treat this in a different way. Sorry, I hope that wasn't too confusing. So where are we at with stem cell therapies? There's certainly, again, our clinical trials here. No approved therapy. I mentioned this before, but there are clinics out there. What exactly they mean with stem cells, I think we need to talk a little bit more about, and those terms will come up again that I mentioned before. I just want to kind of step back and think about this a little bit theoretically, okay? So I mentioned that there's inflammation. So do we need actually to suppress the immune system for that reason? One reason. Do we need to suppress the immune system for a second reason, to allow you to take on a transplant, right? So what role would that immune suppression or that treatment play? Is it treating the disease? Or like that first case or story I talked about with hematopoietic stem cell trials in Canada, is that really confusing the picture? Like, is that the treatment itself that's had the effect in stopping disease activity? So what kind of stem cells? Obviously going to be important. That's why I spent time differentiating. How many stem cells should we give people? I didn't talk about that much at all, but it's a very practical consideration. Also, how often should you be getting this? Is it a one-time shot? Would you need to do it again within months, years? How do you determine when to do that? another important point, and I talked about this a little bit, so where are you going to treat? Are you going to treat in the periphery? Are you going to give it to stem cells back into the blood? Should you be giving them into the central nervous system? Could you do that, we call intrathecally, like through the spinal canal? Should you go straight to the brain? Lots of questions, right? You know, MS, again, is a diffuse disease. There's a lot of downstream effects, but this is a focal therapy. We're giving it in one place. Is it going to know how to get where it needs to go, right? So trials, I mentioned this before, most of the trials, most of the data that we have are between two different kinds of therapy, hematopoietic stem cells and mesenchymal stem cells. Hematopoietic cells, just to be clear, these are things that come from the bone marrow and blood, so they eventually could become immune cells. Usually these trials have been IV injections of these immune cells. The main data we have so far is that they're modulating the immune system somehow, okay? Similar to the talking about how much disease activity from that point forward. Less data that's able to argue that there's been repair or regrowth. Mesenchymal stem cells, so these could come from a lot of different places. They may be engineered. These have been given both IV, but also straight into the nervous system, or intrathecally, we'd say. There are some hopes that maybe this is not just modulating, but could have the ability to remyelinate. I want to contrast this with actually giving neural stem cells, and you'll understand why giving neural stem cells is a little bit of a tricky thing. We take these from brain tissue, right? You can't get cells from the brain tissue very easily. That's difficult to do. So most of these have been taken from other places, like from fetal cells elsewhere. A lot of times these are given intrathecally. There have been a few attempts to deliver to the central nervous system. That's a big surgery. That's not without risk, certainly. So the hope there is because these are neural stem cells, they'll repair. Okay? They'll go down the pathway to make more myelin, as one example. I think that this is a good place to start. So if you're asking, well, what trials have been done, what's out there? Actually, clinicaltrials.gov is a place where some of the private sites, as well as the big research institutions, will publish, hey, here's what we're planning on or we're attempting to do. There's a little bit less when it comes to the outcomes here sometimes, but I'm going to start early. I'm going to start with some of the first trials. So these were also hematopoietic stem cell trials at Northwestern University, which is a place in Chicago. I think it's a good place to kind of point out the difference between a phase 2 and a phase 3 trial, which I'll do in a minute. But I also want to point out a couple other interesting things. So if you look at the first trial, so they gave a couple drugs, cyclophosphamide, which is actually a chemotherapy that's been used off-label to treat MS. Campath, guess what Campath is? It's alemtuzumab, which later was approved to treat MS on its own. And then they gave the person back some of their stem cells in hopes that this could stop progression of MS. Well, the outcomes actually looked pretty good early on. A phase 2 trial, important here, is a proof of concept trial, okay? I'm going to talk about some phase 1 trials, which is even a step before that, which is simply safety trial, okay? Is it safe to do this? Is it safe to give somebody whatever treatment they're looking at? So phase 2, proof of the concept, versus below in a phase 3 trial is actually often a comparison, okay? That comparison historically is placebo or not getting a treatment. So you have two groups so that you can compare. You start with similar people, put some on treatment, some not on treatment, and see the difference. So you really need a phase 3 trial to show that that treatment had an effect as compared to not using that treatment. So this was another conditioning regimen. That's about all I'll probably say about these two trials. It was important to bring up the Northwestern studies because you'll see, again, these were some of the early ones. Actually, the Northwestern group did a lot of different ones later on, sometimes with, I'd say, less intense pre-treatment regimens, but still hematopoietic stem cells.
And the second one, was that also hematopoietic?
Yes. So autologous hematopoietic stem cell transplant. This was, again, using conditioning, cyclophosphamide, as well as other treatments. Some of the patients were on a a comparison versus on placebo. Is there another question? Yeah.
Are we going to be able to get this in paper form?
Yeah, that's fine by me. I'm happy to share. I can leave a copy on here, and we'll figure out how to distribute. No problem.
Do you think that the stem cell research that they're doing now can unravel the mystery of how identical twins, one twin takes one medicine and it works, and the other twin takes that same medicine and it does not work? I know because I have an identical twin sister, and we take completely different medicines for the same disease.
I'm not sure if stem cell treatments or trials are going to give us that answer. I think there's a genetic component to MS, but let me save some of the questions, until I wrap up. Okay. So I'm going to point out just a couple other trials that I think are important. The Ottawa group. This is the Canadian stem cell trial that I talked about. Some of the results recently being published on. Again, it's important to understand that this was a pre-treatment with the chemotherapy. And this was to study whether this high-dose chemo and the stem cell transplant can make a difference on the inflammatory disease. So looking for long-term stabilization, which they argued, and they were able to show. Another very popular trial a lot of you may have heard of, some people may even have known or had participated in, was the HALT MS trial. This one's actually a lot wider trial, so it's not just at places like Ohio State, but places far away as Washington, groups down in Texas. This was, again, a high-dose immunosuppressive therapy followed by giving your own hematopoietic stem cells back. I think that it's important to notice at the very bottom, the reason that they justified the transplant at all was because after you've wiped out the immune system, they wanted to make sure you had enough cells to fight off infections. So the investigators here actually weren't imagining this so much as a repair, regenerate trial, as a hit it with high-dose chemotherapy. Nothing else has worked in this person's MS. Then to rescue the bone marrow suppression that they created, they gave back hematopoietic stem cells. So what does this look like? And this is kind of the extreme example of getting an induction regimen. So some of these parts may be missing depending on the trial, but this is kind of the most inclusive. Sometimes you actually get GCSFs, granulocyte colony stimulating factor. So this is something that makes your body make more cells, okay? More hematopoietic cells in particular here, so that then they can take some of them out, keep those on the side while they hit the patient with high-dose chemo. Sometimes this is something like alemtuzumab. Other times they would even combine in a trial like this total body irradiation. That's the TBI there. So kind of like this is what you would imagine a stem cell treatment for a cancer might be, or a high-dose induction therapy followed by stem cells, and MS has been in some of these trials. That's a kind of a pictorial representation of the chemo followed by hematopoietic stem cells. To kind of summarize, so what do we have now? I mentioned there's been a lot of these trials. We have over 700 patients that have been treated. There was significant mortality in a lot of these early trials, particularly the ones that look like this. So up to 5% plus of patients died from the treatment. That's been reduced. I mentioned, for instance, the Northwestern group was kind of backed off on how much induction. So in some of the more recent trials with HSCT, only 1% to 2% mortality rates. So the positives of a trial like this, well, certainly we can dramatically decrease relapses. We can suppress inflammation. Disabilities, been arrested in a number of these cases. If you take as a whole, these 700 plus patients, about 60% of them plus have had extended periods of stopping disability progression. So it's certainly a powerful therapy for malignant forms of MS, I would say. So typically when other things didn't work, you might go down this path. Some of the limitations, it's not necessarily a cure, right? Not in the way that we're thinking of repair, regeneration. There are these toxic effects, side effects potentially. And then one of the curious things is just there's a real lack of consensus on what we should do as a pre-treatment regimen. Okay. this is interesting. This is pretty recent. So I snapped a picture from one of our recent conferences where I thought this was actually a great, we call it meta-analysis. So somebody pooled all the different hematopoietic stem cell trials out there. I mentioned the Northwestern group. This is their early studies. You'll see the name again. So with a much lower intensity pre-treatment regimen. You may notice some of these names. It encompasses a lot of the hematopoietic stem cells that have been done, trials that have been done in MS at big research institutions. Yeah.
Are you going to touch on any about people with cancer who had stem cells in this?
That's a great question. There are some case reports of people that have had both. Okay.
I have.
Sorry, I can repeat.
I was diagnosed with MS in 08 and multiple myeloma last year, so I've had stem cell transplant. So I'm dying to know
What does that mean?
what's going to happen with my MS.
I would ask you, do you know what kind of transplant? Right?
Told me, everybody says in theory my MS should be gone.
Yeah, it's a great question. So, again, I'll come back and do some more questions later, but I'll just to try to answer briefly. What happens if you get treated for a cancer and you have MS? A lot of times the treatments are chemotherapies or things that will kill rapidly dividing cells. Immune cells are rapidly dividing cells. So you'll find that a lot of our treating physicians like me will say, well, you don't need additional treatment for the MS sometimes if we're treating the cancer aggressively. It may not be true forever. Okay, there simply aren't enough controlled trials to talk to you about, well, what does this specific treatment mean for my MS, having had both of these? But very good question. I'm going to jump to talk about mesenchymal stem cells next, okay? So we could give your own, we could give from someone else. You could do it with or without immune suppression. A lot of these trials, particularly the later ones, have been done without immune suppression, and a lot of the ones done in private clinics are mesenchymal stem cell trials or treatments without immune suppression. There's some, and again, theoretical questions to ask. So are you really stopping the inflammation then? Are you stopping this immune disease if you're only giving back cells that aren't immune cells? And then another question is, well, do I want to give cells from a person with an immune disease back to that person? Would I expect a different outcome? You know, if I'm taking cells from a diseased person, and I probably wouldn't give that to another person, right? But do I even give it back to the same one and expect that they're not going to have disease again? I'm using the clinicaltrials.gov website again to mention, so this was the Cleveland Plain Dealer I talked about before. This was the phase 1 study that they did. Again, phase 1, safety only. So is it safe? Is it feasible to give someone's own cells back to them? There were some secondary outcome measures looking at, and this is how we got the data, talking about MRI activity, talking about disease activity and relapse. This is what this would look like, a little bit different. So you harvest cells, you take cells out, whether you're getting them from bone marrow, which is kind of what's pictured here, or taking them from somewhere else. You're using the lab to kind of, you could say, grow up or to let them reproduce, and then giving them back to the patient. Not all of these trials, particularly a lot of the private and some of the same days, are actually growing them or doing much to them after they take them out before they put them in. But I can't try or begin to talk about each of those different clinics individually. So mesenchymal stem cells, I'm going to kind of do the same thing. I talked about the meta-analysis from the HSCT trials. Here's kind of a pictorial representation or graph of the mesenchymal stem cells. I'll say that these have been given in lots of different conditions, okay? Not just MS. There's thousands upon thousands of patients treated with these. There may even be close to that many MS patients that have been treated with some sort of mesenchymal stem cell therapy. It does seem to be a little bit safer, right? Especially if we aren't using chemotherapy. So we haven't seen a lot of toxicity warnings. There is, I should say, some data that this may alter the immune system. So simply doing this procedure, taking them and putting them back in, may alter the course of disease. There's not a lot of comparison trials to show versus not treating like this, but there's a lot of here's what happened before and here's what happened after, to at least raise the question whether they're doing that. And then there are some encouraging reports, kind of like what I showed you from the newspaper even 5 years ago, where people saying that they had, improvement or repair, perhaps. So these are a little bit all over the place in terms of where they're getting the cells from, where they're putting them back, the indications in the trials. The Cleveland Plain Dealer, this is one of their more recent publications at the top from University Hospitals, Bruce Cohen. So relapse and remitting, secondary progressive MS. So kind of taking different types of patients, but the same sort of a treatment. You can see on down the line some of these patients, the difference between in defining terms like refractory and chronic MS, they all defined it a little bit differently. But I'm going to show you that these are small numbers of patients, okay? And then in the source, most of these, they're taking them from, or not most of them, but a lot of them came from bone marrow. Some of them were taken from other places like adipose tissue. A lot of times they did expand them or try to let them grow. Some of these included chemotherapy. Some of them, they were given back in the blood, IV, other times intrathecally. So it's a little bit all over the board, even in the big research institutions and what we have published. I'm going to talk just briefly about this. I mentioned this idea before. So what about forgetting about giving hematopoietic immune cells or mesenchymal cells that you hope might go down the right pathway? What if you just give neural cells, right? This has been done. I'll show you a couple places, at least that are registered with clinicaltrials.gov, where they've given them typically straight into the central nervous system, at least intrathecally, to try to bring them closer to neural tissue that they're hoping they may have an effect on in terms of repair, regrowth, regeneration. I will tell you that, and this is going to come up again, we have been able to show, at least in mice, that you can take human oligodendrocyte precursor cells and myelinate what's called a shiverer mouse, or a mouse that doesn't have has dysmyelination, actually loss or damage of myelin, or not completely formed myelin. They've shown the ability to physically do that, if not improve the function or show that it works. Okay. So the best ones I could find, or the ones that I could find with the best description, there's a couple at clinicaltrials.gov from Thailand. Again, phase 1. All right. So is it safe to give human OPCs from a culture of human brain back to a person with MS? There's even phase 2 trials of trying to show proof of concept that and this, read carefully, right? So can these OPCs in culture turn into progenitor cells that can replicate on down the line in the research center, okay? So in the Petri dish, really. I talked about this just briefly at the very beginning. I mentioned induced pluripotent stem cells. So the problem with giving a lot of things into a growth media or turning on transcription factors is this actually is what happens to cells that replicate too much, like in cancer, right? So induced pluripotent stem cells, there are some concerns when it comes to that. The other problem is, remember, these are, if you're talking about pluripotent cells, that can go down a lot of different lines. So if you gave it, you may have to give a lot so that there's enough that do what you wanted it to do. Or you may have to figure out how to do something to the patient or give something with it to make it go down the cell line that you want to do. Perhaps neural stem cells, perhaps even further down to oligodendrocyte progenitor cells that can make myelin. So not quite ready, perhaps, to start doing this in patients, or at least it would take a lot of screening of the cells before you could give it back. So all this takes time, remember. So when you're thinking about the trials that are out there and getting cells taken from you and then them turning them into something else, think about how much time that might take. I want to talk about another concept I think that is certainly appropriate when we talk about stem cells, and that's the fact that we have them already, right? So there's stem cells in your body. There's stem cells in the brain. On autopsy, we see stem cells, and we don't know why they weren't turned on or fixing or repairing the damage that happened in patients with MS. It's possible, or at least it's theoretically possible, that we could figure out how to turn them on, right? So how to make them repair. If we could give the right sort of, whether it's a diet even, something as simple as that, or the right kind of medicine to turn on cells that are already there is another really fascinating question and a whole nother area of research when it comes to stem cell trials, stem cell therapy, okay? Mostly in the lab so far to try to show proof of concept before you would try to go into the patient. And I'll mention, for instance, retinoids, so vitamin A, is one of the things we put in growth meat. It does increase the yield of making oligodendrocyte progenitor cells, for instance. Problem is sometimes too much of a good thing like vitamin A can be bad, right? So you can get toxicity, you can have blindness, other problems. So trying to figure that out, not just what we can do in a petri dish, but what's safe to do then in a person, is one of our questions in this arena or this part of stem cell therapy, stem cell study. So I thought it was fun just to work with headlines a lot. Okay, that's kind of a theme. And again, 2011, great year for stem cell trials or stem cell therapies. This up the road, New York, New York. This is Dr. Siddiq, who, if you've done any research into stem cells, you probably have heard or seen the name. I think some of these names changed along the way. It actually took quite a long time, from 2011 until, you see on the next slide, about 3 years before the trials actually got off the ground, although there was approval. If you go now to the Tisch MS Center or tischms.org, there are some pretty interesting claims, okay? So I'm not sure what it's actually saying. So no treatment has shown reversal of established disability in MS. I might stop there, or should you say, until now, because you're arguing, at least you're leading people to believe that you're showing reversal of established disability, okay? Well, let's go back to clinical trials, right? This trial is registered there. It is a phase 1 trial, so again, it's safety and tolerability. What they're doing is giving intrathecal mesenchymal stem cells into patients with progressive MS, and they do it 3 times over a 3-month interval. Again, primary outcome, they're looking for adverse events, so anybody that had a problem at these different time points. Secondary outcomes were some attempts to look at efficacy. So 20 patients started eventually in April 2014, should be done pretty soon. We hope maybe we'll get some data soon. There have been a couple preliminary hints at the data, but we'll see, right? So we need to take it to the next step to show in a comparison trial perhaps, in a phase 3 trial, that this made a difference as compared to not treating with this in the same sort of a population. What else can you find out there? So just a very quick search that any of you could do, and I'm sure some of you have done. You'll find stemcelltreatmentnow.com that pops up right away. Okay, this is actually a Chinese biotech company. If you go to the website, there's a ton of videos, and you'll see that they specialize in neurologic disorders, but that includes a lot of things, and it included autism, perhaps, for instance. It included some of the behavioral disorders and treatments with children, and thousands of clinics, hospitals in China for a report. Okay, another couple that have been around, has been established for a long time. There's something called ACT. There's another group called MCell in Ukraine. They happen to specialize in fetal stem cell transplants, so stuff that may not be done here so much. They advertise directly to patients. So you just pop up on the website, tell you how to get in contact with them. You could certainly get more information. In the USA, there's a couple in particular that are pretty popular. Stemgenics in the San Diego area. I've had more than one patient that have had an experience here. So interesting, when you go to these sites, they treat not just, or will treat not just patients with multiple sclerosis, but also Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, other neurologic conditions, and then less neurologic things, diabetes, arthritis, both when it's an immune arthritis or when it's wear and tear arthritis, other autoimmune diseases, a little bit more broad. There's STEM medics in Florida. I think they had all the same indications that were listed with STEMgenics, but they also included ALS, another neurologic disease, COPD, chronic fatigue and age management, a little bit less of a disease than I think we treat on a normal basis. You'll find not just these websites, but lots of testimonials, okay? It didn't take me long to find sites where people say, I'm trying to have a stem cell transplant, I just can't get it paid for, I'm trying to raise the money. There are sites, there are people that are responding in the blog saying, congratulations, I'm glad you're seeking this out. Have you thought about going overseas? Have you, you could look forward to not just stopping the progression of this illness, but maybe, they don't say maybe, but they say improvement on top of that. Also, you don't have to look far to find people that have the different experience, okay? And unfortunately, I think a lot of us in this arena have seen this as well. So the patients come back and say they felt like they were tricked, all right? I lost a lot of money. This didn't do anything for me. So unfortunately, this experience has happened. There are clinics that do get shut down or move or change their name. It's a tough thing to regulate, and I'm going to get back to that headline to show you why in a minute. So let's start with the other one, though. Okay, myelinating oligodendrocytes derived from primary progressive MS patients. This is actually working with Dr. Sadiq's group. I think this is interesting. This is fascinating. This is good work. So they made induced pluripotent stem cells from skin in patients with MS. They, in the lab, were able to shorten the time it took them to make them into oligodendrocyte progenitor cells. It used to take us 4 months, and now it takes us 2.5, maybe 3 months, okay? And then, not only do you make OPCs, but what do they do? Do they actually look like other OPCs in the body normally? Yeah, about half of them do. So this is a better yield than we used to have. This field is progressing. These numbers used to be like 10%. And then how many of them could actually not just look like oligodendrocyte OPCs, I'll say, but how many could actually turn over mature oligodendrocytes that then can do the same thing on their own? The numbers are a little bit smaller, okay? In the lab, this is kind of what I was talking about with the shiver mice. They've even taken these cells that did come from patients a few steps back, given them to mice, and shown that they do make myelin. Okay? That other headline. So this is the front page just about a year ago. Okay. So unregulated stem cells clinics proliferate despite court ruling. Well, what happened? So there's a lot of interest in that. There's a lot of people on the plus side, a lot of people on the minus side. There was a district court ruling that says that stem cell therapy should fall within the FDA regulation. Okay, so this is something that should have the oversight of the Food and Drug Administration. Well, that didn't stop everybody. All right, that didn't stop these websites, certainly. In fact, there's probably more now than there was a year ago. There's a little bit of a loophole here that's important to understand or maybe know about. So cells that are grown in culture and then manipulated certainly require FDA oversight. We call those 351 cells according to the statute here, okay? 361 cells are a little bit different. So if you take a cell and you have it perform a similar function from when you took it and after, minimal manipulation is allowed, particularly if it's taken from self. So it's one of the reasons why a lot of the homologous stem cell trials are out there or are allowed in private clinics. Right? So the argument, if you're on this shouldn't be regulated side, is adipose cells, just like any other cells, are supposed to regenerate. That's what a stem cell does, whether it's doing adipose tissue or doing something else. What qualifies as minimal manipulation is a little bit debated. And then if you don't want to get into that argument, you can simply do it in the same procedure. So if you take the cells out and under the same surgery or the same day maybe you're there, give them back, then you can argue that well, this isn't, manipulating, this isn't doing anything outside that the body couldn't perhaps have done on its own, and this is allowed as a 361, cell doesn't need FDA oversight. So I'm talking mostly about the FDA in the U.S. there, but the same things are happening in Europe. And there are some they have gotten tighter regulations in the EU, but there's probably the most well-known example of this where the company closed down or changed its name was there was a German company, they called themselves Excel Center a couple years ago. It was the biggest anywhere in Europe, but they shut down. So this was an example of giving cells directly into the brain. They did it with an infant who died. There was a lot of backlash over that, so they completely shut their doors. They reopened not long later in a different country, Lebanon, called their new company Cells for Health. I know they've moved at least once after that. So these stories, these are just a few examples. There are others. I want to kind of give you some other sites to look at, okay? So besides doing a search, what are some reputable sites that I would encourage you to go to if you're saying, hey, I want to know more about stem cells, what's happening today. Maybe I even want to go think about having a treatment or a trial. The International Society for Stem Cell Research, their website, Closer Look at stemcells.org. I do agree this is consumer-friendly, talks about the current state of the science. I won't read each one of these points individually, but I think they're reasonable points for us to consider. There's actually a website that also is for clinicians. When your patients ask you about stem cells, what should you say? Well, we have to say that, listen, the proof of safety, but particularly efficacy, is a little bit lacking in some of these instances. There is something to lose. And we talk about cost, and I don't just mean the cost like money monetarily. I mean cost like are the risk involved. Important points here, and I kind of highlighted, there were clinics that do the same treatment for a number of diseases. That seems a little bit strange to us that treat these diseases, right? So there are different stem cells that have different purposes in the body, and it would be a stretch for us to imagine that the same treatment's going to work for these very different conditions. So patient testimonials, I think I kind of hit this point, and other marketing maybe could be misleading. There's sometimes not a lot of oversight in that, particularly when it's not an FDA treatment. The process by which science becomes medicine, and this is what something like the FDA is supposed to do, is to minimize harm, try to maximize effectiveness. I'll leave you with a few of my own points. Again, stem cells right now, they're not a magic bullet. They're not necessarily a quick fix. This is a lifetime span disease in most cases. They may, and I think that there is some evidence that they change immune function or the bad problems with the immune system. And they may, we've shown benefit that they can repair or regrow at least. The hope is that they may fix damage or disability someday too. The last thing I'll leave you with, if you are thinking about this, is be really clear about what you're looking for. Is this, I've tried other treatments, I need something that's going to stop my disease? Are you thinking that this is a cure in that sense? Are you thinking it's a cure in the sense of repair or return to function? And then do as much homework as you feel you need to do before you're comfortable, so you know what you're getting, you know what the cost is. Try to find, if you can, published peer-reviewed literature showing what have they shown so far. What is the efficacy here? What is the safety here? I do think the research should be carried out under some supervision, but certainly with some level of transparency. So I've had an unfortunate experience where patients that go for a treatment, but they're not really sure what they got, okay? Or we asked the clinics or the places where they went what was done, and it's a little bit secretive. So I would encourage any of you to discuss plans for something like this in detail with your neurologist. We want to get an opinion about your specific case, your specific situation. And I do think, again, this is a lifetime disease. You're going to need follow-up regardless, right? So I hope that was informative. I'm happy to take questions now, and I'll let you guys fire away, please.
Is there any peer-reviewed literature about this? From what you said, it sounds like there shouldn't be, but it's hard to know.
There is. So, the Canadian stem cell trial, for instance, all right? This is probably the most well-published. This was just presented at one of our conferences in the summertime. There, unfortunately, is a little bit lacking data when it comes to both something that's done in a research institution like the university hospitals or something that's done maybe up the street, the Tisch MS Center. I think we all expect that to change. I hope that the next conferences we go to, we're going to see a lot more. There have been presentations even without anybody publishing it and attaching their names to it. So this, distinction I've made between research institutions and private, I guess, is a little bit unfair. When we think about something like solving the human genome, so the private companies did that before government-sponsored big research institutions. There's no reason to think this has to be done one place or the other, but I think that the transparency has to be there, and part of that is getting the data out there. We're hoping that a phase 3 trial showing efficacy is shortly or on the horizon, right? So to be determined, I guess. Other questions? Did I confuse everybody? I'm sorry if there's a lot of terms in there.
I just have a comment.
Yeah.
I wanted to say thank you very much for doing this, because now I feel that everyone in here is more informed to make choices and decisions as to how they're going to live their life while they're living their life.
Well, thank you for saying that, Serena. My goal was to make this a little bit easier to understand. What do we mean when we say stem cell?
Because the whole subject of stem cell is vast. Just like the nervous system, you got the PNS, you got the SNS, and then you got your CNS, and then you have this, which I can't pronounce half the words associated.
I tripped on it a couple times.
So you made it easier. I mean, I still have the kaleidoscope effect in my brain, which I will read all of this slowly.
Well, that means other people must also have questions, so please.
I'm sure
I have a
Yeah. Please. Why don't I'll give you 2, and then we'll rotate, and then we may come back. Pick your favorite 2.
Where they're retrieved from the hip, I saw that, or generally from the hip.
Sometimes hematopoietic stem cells are taken from the bone marrow.
Yay! But how are they cleaned or altered to ensure that they are indeed trying to remyelinate instead of reproduce my liver?
So those cells,
Like your skin or something.
if they're hematopoietic stem cells, will become blood cells of some type. Okay, so the bone marrow makes blood cells. It makes both red blood cells carrying oxygen. I'm making it really simple. Or white blood cells have to do with the immune system. So thinking of this as an immune disease is one of the reasons why people use hematopoietic stem cells. Talking about chemotherapy or knocking out rapidly dividing cells often suppresses bone marrow. There's drugs that we give that do that as well.
Okay.
So taking these cells before you wipe them out so that you give them back is the idea behind taking these cells from bone marrow.
But you're pretty confident that when you return my own stem cells to me that they are going to go where they're supposed to go and not something.
Well, the only thing I can tell you is I know they're going into the blood in most of those cases because they're giving back these cells in the IV. So they're giving you blood cells back into your bloodstream. Whether they're going anywhere else or not is tougher for us to show.
And number 2 would be, I have progressive. Others have relapsing remitting. Is this similar technology supposed to work for this?
It's a great question.
Opposite
Well,
entities.
I think I could give an entire lecture on relapsing versus progressive MS, and I'm going to be brief about it to say that these entities aren't completely distinct. You'll talk to people who think that it is the same disease at different time points. One thing that we talk about a lot is there evidence of disease activity that we can measure? Okay, so are there MRI changes? So is there evidence of inflammation? Someone could have progression of disability, but still be having an attack, at least radiographically, if not clinically. People have invented a lot of terms like relapsing progressive, secondary progressive, to imply that it changed at some point. You saw these trials. I think one interesting thing that Dr. Sadiq's trial is doing is they took patients that had progressive MS, so people where things were going downhill without any evidence of recovery, versus if you take relapsing patients and then you measure their disability, well, depending on when you measure, they might actually get better, right? So it's hard for me to know, for instance, the gentleman, the Cleveland Plain dealer, was he having an attack that was getting better, and that's why his fatigue got better? You know, there are a lot of difficult questions to answer, and even in some of our trials that of drugs that may soon be on the horizon, I think some of these very similar questions are appropriate to ask, okay? So what kind of disease did these patients really have? What effect were you having? Was it stopping inflammation? Was it helping patients recover? Are two different things, right? Good questions. Did I confuse you? I'll come back. I know you have more. Maybe other people ask similar
I
ones.
have mine too.
Sir.
Your comments have been, I guess, interdisciplinary, oncology, neurology, infectious disease.
Yeah.
What kind of physician are you?
I am a neurologist, okay? A lot of these trials are done, at least at research institutions, with somebody who's in the hematology oncology field. Whereas you mentioned earlier, a lot more has been done with stem cells, particularly these hematopoietic stem cells, okay? So these are blood cells. So great question. I hope that I was clear. I'm sorry if I wasn't from the beginning, but I am a neurologist that treats multiple sclerosis. Anybody else?
And you're an expert researcher.
I won't claim to be too much of an expert, but
That
I
was
do my
great.
best.
No, that was a
I
great
can tell you a lot about this. I don't particularly do stem cell research, right?
You
So
do research a lot.
I've had limited experience in this. My experience actually was more what I hinted at, which was trying to figure out what do you do in the growth media to try to make turn stem cells on or send them down the right path. So it gets very specific when it comes to research. I have not been an investigator, although I've taken care of a lot of patients that have sought treatment in trials like this. That's right.
How many patients
Oops.
have had of yours have had stem cells in your second? Do you treat patients with reflex synthetic dystrophy also now it's chronic?
Can you repeat the question for those?
Yeah. So the first question was, how many patients have I had that have sought a stem cell therapy? And the numbers are just approaching double digits, okay? And some of them have been in the trials that I showed you on purpose, okay? Some of them have, like I hinted at, also sought treatment in Panama or in the Far East, where I'm not sure exactly what kind of trial it was. Unfortunately, no. In fact, I've often had the experience where a patient comes to me and tells me that I've been seeing them, and then they come and say, I went and did this, versus I'm thinking of going and doing this. Would you talk to the person, or would you give them my records? Kind of. Good question. The second one was?
About a different disorder.
I might save that one.
Reflex synthetic.
I'm going to give you one at a time. I'm sorry. I saw a lot of hands.
That's fine.
Different disease. So
Because you mentioned other diseases.
yeah. So what is your question about this therapy in other diseases? Certainly, multiple sclerosis is one of many diseases where stem cell treatment trials is a hot topic. That's what I'd say. I'm sure that there are trials for reflex sympathetic dystrophy or other conditions similar to that. You had a hand up, please.
Wanted to talk about anecdotal versus science. Okay.
Yeah.
So much of this, I'm sure many people here do their research online, and as you say, there are many kinds of, and many, feel to me to be obviously disreputable, and other ones that look more, possible. I'm wondering what is the timeline for HSCT science? How long before they start publishing anything? And
Just starting to come out, now a decade into some of these earlier, bigger trials. So that's my first answer. But
Yeah, no, I mean, and I guess the thing is that they're not, nobody's covering it right now. I mean, I guess no insurances or anything like that.
Right.
Do you think that at some point when these tests, the results are coming in, do you think there will be some coverage for that? Or is it that you're always going to be on your own? Or
well, it's interesting because I would argue that some of these trials actually led to the approval of some of our treatments out there, right? So you mentioned the hematopoietic stem cell trials, and you saw that I mentioned Campath, which is a drug used in a different disease, actually chemotherapy, to fight blood cancers, is now alemtuzumab when we use it to fight MS. So there were secondary trials. What we need are not just phase 1 proof of safety, phase 2 proof of concept, but phase 3 proof of efficacy.
I get all that.
So
I guess
that's the reason why there aren't approved therapies, because there haven't been these sort of comparison trials.
What I'm curious about.
What do I think?
Because
Yeah.
primary progressive is always a me too. Like they don't even bother with us until later, so that most people who have primary progressive, if they're looking into this, are looking online and at a couple of locations throughout the world to have it done. So evaluating it is very difficult because we're not going to see any trial results for primary progressive probably for quite some time, I would assume. Because that Bird's trial in Chicago it won't touch people with primary progressive. So I guess, if you're looking to do research into whether this is an appropriate thing for yourself, what are the best avenues to avoid
Dose.
Stop it with those things. It's a dose problem. No, to do that sort of research for yourself, to avoid all the pitfalls.
You asked a lot of good questions in there. You made a couple great important points, and I should let you come up and talk about. So she talked in the beginning. I almost would use words like about fake news. Okay, what is? How do you sort out what's real versus claims? Okay, that's why I tried to give you a few sites. Other questions were about where do I go? Where do I turn? What am I going to use to try to make sense of all this? I tried to give you a few sites that I think are reputable, that you can figure out what's on the horizon or what is happening today. I actually am encouraged. Okay, I didn't mean to be discouraging about this. I think that we're near having proof one way or the other from a trial like Dr. Sadiq is a primary progressive MS trial,
After very mixed.
right? I think that there's also patients who are not in the trial that are being offered treatments, not just there, but in a lot of different places. I hope that the next step is we're going to do a comparison trial and compare using this versus something else, whether it's a different drug that's already been out there or... Right. It's a great question. I think it's kind of the bottom line of what I danced around, and then I tried to give you some data to help you look at this through this lens and some sites to go to and do your own homework or as much as you feel you need to. Sir?
National Health in England apparently is doing some of these procedures, at least for relapsing remitting. Is that covered?
I would ask you your source that states that.
I don't know.
So we do a lot of international meetings, and I can tell you there are differences in one country to the next in what they cover, even in our approved therapies. All right. The closest thing to what I talked about that they're covering would be something like alemtuzumab, and the idea of rescue so that you don't have prolonged suppression of immune cells. That's the best of my knowledge. But there's a lot of different sites out there, a lot of different places that are offering treatments, right? And I can't be exhaustive. I thought I would hit the highlights, the things that I'm sure have come up if you've done your own surgeons. Anybody? Yes, sir. Please. The cost. Oh wow. I've had, a handful of patients do this. This is the most recent number that my patient gave me. Okay. Again, I don't have anything from the company or the place that he went in, from them to me, but this is what he said he had to pay out of pocket.
Which was
$17,000.
$17,000, right?
That was once.
And that was mesenchymal, right?
Correct. And he is not the only patient who tells me they offer to retreat. Okay. So
One treatment costs $17,000.
it could be very different from one of these places to the next, and it could be just like medical care is here, different from one patient to the next. I don't know the particulars of that.
Yeah, a friend of mine is doing it at Dr. Burke in
Yeah.
Chicago, and she did a GoFundMe for $25,000. So.
Wow. So to me, a clinical trial, true clinical trial, shouldn't cost you something. Right?
Well, I think that's for everything. Like
Yeah.
living there for duration, taking care of family, kids.
So now I understand.
Flights, like the whole.
I better understand why there were 150 patients in the more recent one. What's that?
I don't think the Burt trial is paying for it. I think individuals are raising the money to do it themselves. And he's running a trial to create an umbrella for the people who wanted to do it, I guess. But it is kind of because
Not all of these cost money. Okay, there are true trials where there's a sponsor, but many of them do. And I guess I'm going to try to avoid talking more about insurance and cost if I have a question on a different topic.
I was wondering who does cover it, not because I just
No insurance company that I know of would cover
No, I
anything.
meant the trials where they cover it. It was the Canadian trial, I assume.
So the Stem Cell Tolerance Network, there's a couple of different groups out there that are funding stem cell research, whether it's stem cell research on the science side, whether it's stem cell research in the patient side. There's more of the first, and then there's the latter right now. And that's their choice on who submits an application and who they choose to fund. Sir?
Has there been any stem cell done yet at UOP or in the United States?
At the University of Pennsylvania, not in the MS group, not in the neurology group, but in other diseases, yes, there are.
Horizon or?
It's a great question. I thought I might get this one, and I thought about how to answer it, right? So I would like to be able to offer something that I think is ready, okay? My response would probably be, I'm not sure this is ready for prime time. And it depends on what kind of patient you're talking about. So if somebody has really bad disease, I think that I would really want to stop the inflammation. And we have a lot of ways we do that. And we have a lot of trials that try to figure out how to do that better, how to do that safer. When it comes to repair and regeneration, anytime we hear about it, we're as excited as you are. Where I think that we're at is trying to figure out, all right, we can show this works in a dish. At least we can grow myelin. We're not at the place where we can show that the myelin functions, for instance. So I'm a little bit hesitant to, although I hope to start saying we're opening our doors, stem cell therapy, stem cell trial. I hope it works. I don't think that it's my personal idea that I don't think that it's right to offer that, for us to try to offer that at cost, maybe, without proven efficacy. I think that everybody's a little bit different. I think that there's a lot going on. There's a lot happening.
Which is hope in itself, which is the hope, just this meeting, there's hope
Yeah.
towards helping everybody with all forms of MS, not just relapse and remitting, but the progressive versions. I tell everybody, MS is progressive no matter which one you have, because it's like, I had it since 1997. I am not the same today as I was in 97. So it's progressive. Some people just more aggressively and more rapidly, so the inflammation and progression never goes
They may be, yeah.
Right, there's a lot of applications with stem cell in itself. So I'm glad you came because this whole topic is beyond me. So I'm glad you came. You helped condense it and simplify it a lot.
I hope so.
Appreciate that you did.
Would you
I don't
be,
have a kaleidoscope in my brain anymore.
Sir, sir, let me.
sure.
I know you had your hand up before. I didn't get to you. Please. Yeah, it's a great question. This was one that I asked. So, if you're going to do a trial, why shouldn't the person, the investigator, pay for it, or the perhaps pharmaceutical company that stands to get this approved and perhaps gain from it, pay for it? That's what I would argue, right? So, there are different ways to raise funding. These things do cost a lot of money, but asking patients to pay for unproven therapy is one of the reasons why I'm not sure this does cost a lot of money. I'm not sure that we're ready down the street here to enter into this game in the MS world, or MS space. I think I'll take questions till 8:30 if there are any, but then we got 6 more minutes. Anybody else? So Serena actually did a good job explaining what do I actually do research in most of the time. Well, I do a lot of research to try to figure stuff like this out, but what do I do trials in? Some of this is trying to figure out newer or better therapies. I deal with a disease that some of you may have heard of called neuromyelitis optica as well. So I'm an investigator. It's an interesting question. So NMO implies that there's a problem in the spinal cord and or the eyes. It looks very similar to multiple sclerosis. There is, again, overlap, like a Venn diagram, but some people think of it as something different, and there's been advances to show that there may be a certain antibody that is part of the pathology there. So I'm the investigator on a trial trying to get one of our first approved drugs for that treatment. I look at complications of infectious issues that Serena mentioned. So JC virus is the causative agent of PML, which is a complication with some of our high efficacy therapies. So I do a lot of research trying to figure out how do we better treat patients safely, how do we better understand testing for things like that. Good question. I'm happy to talk about that stuff, but anybody else on the stem cell
I'm just curious,
topic?
you're gonna put these stem cells in like somebody's back or something. What's to stop once they start growing myelin, just keep on growing myelin into a tumor or something?
I didn't list this as one of the theoretical concerns, but it is for many people, all right? So if you have a cell that keeps replicating, there are concerns that it could become a tumor. And actually, I didn't talk about this, but there have been trials in other diseases. Unfortunately, one of the diseases where I think that this maybe has a better fit, spinal cord injury, had a trial that was stopped because tumor cell growth at the site where they tried to put in stem cells. That was a while back. They've since redone it and tried to figure this out. Some of these, and I didn't talk about this so much, I didn't want to scare people talking about the bad sides, but some of the neural stem cell trials, like the baby that died, people that have gone for ALS trials directly into the brain, they found tumors after. There's reports of this. There's not, good documented literature showing this, but it is a concern that people have had. I think that's why most of the trials and clinics out there are using mesenchymal stem cells that are thought to be safer. What they're doing, if they're altering the immune dysfunction, we may have some data to show that, versus growing a lot of cells or not is a bigger ask. But we actually had a hard time showing in studies like mouse models that these cells last. So you can radio label them and see after weeks it's hard to find them again. So a lot of
Maybe pump the brakes a little bit when I heard that. I started, whoa.
a lot of different
That
concerns.
won't be worse.
Good question. Anybody else?
This is going to sound like a silly question.
Yeah.
You talked about 351 and 361.
Right.
In one, they take the cells out and they do whatever they do before they reinsert them. And the other one, they hardly do anything to them be kind of ridiculous?
maybe
to
I should-
put them back in?
Maybe I should talk. So she asked about this designation that I referenced, 351, 361. 361 designation was actually created so that people could get vein allografts. So you could take a vein from somebody, like a vein stripping procedure, and put it back into somebody
Got it.
the same day, so that those things were allowed before the FDA required a lot of phase 3 data and trials to show that there was proof. The FDA had decided, though, if you're going to take cells out and manipulate them quite a bit, like perhaps make them induce pluripotent stem cells, they can replicate a lot, then there should be more oversight before you're allowed to put those back into something.
Okay.
I hope that helps a little bit.
Well, it just seems kind of silly. Let's take some blood from your bone marrow and once you reinsert them the same day. It's kind of ridiculous.
And I hope that the point wasn't lost when you talked about taking cells out, putting them back in the same procedure, same day. The point that I tried to make about our advances in the lab was that it takes a while to actually turn these cells down the right path. So could you imagine that it's actually possible to do that so quickly the same day? We haven't been able to show that very well, although it's being done quite a bit. All right, I think we're...
One more, Vic.
Whoops, please.
Okay, this is really off the wall.
Go ahead.
All right.
I like it. All
Like
right.
for your, well, maybe not, but like for your study. Now, I always wanted to donate my body to science to try to come up with like what you're trying to do with the stem cells or what triggers them in your brain. I mean, if people, like I know people do donate their bodies to science and all that just to try to get answers. I mean, is that something that can be used?
So, correct me if I'm wrong. You're asking in the area of stem cells. So I know I have them. Could I donate?
Well, no.
After
If I was to die and I had MS, then ooh, good. We didn't check her head to see, if there's stem cells. You can figure out what would trigger them. Do you know what I mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
How
So
you
we
can
know that
figure
they
out
are
with the
there.
science, how you could figure out like what it's
How to turn them on is
right, how
one
you
of our
can turn
questions.
them on and stuff like that.
There are many labs that would love to study your brain and other people like you's brains that try to answer that question.
So you would want our brains, in other words.
I may not be even the best person. So I did some training out west where there are very different rules about each state's different, right? And there's different funding sources from one state to the next about what you're allowed to do with human tissue. So I know I can direct you to the places that may be more interested in something like that. Anybody else? Last questions? It's so nice to see some familiar faces as well as meet some new people. I hope that you learned at least a couple things. You got to hear some interesting ideas, and I gave you some takeaways. I don't know if I'd say this isn't right for anybody. I just encourage you to really talk to your physician and figure out if it's right for you by asking some of these sorts of questions and doing some of the homework to better understand what you're reading when you see these sorts of headlines out there. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to share this. I have it electronically.
I will email it out.
We'll email it.